Hello Year 12 and welcome to Lesson 4 in our topic Lenin and the Civil War. And in today's lesson we're going to find out how the Bolsheviks dealt with the problem of ending the war. So we'll look at why the Bolsheviks signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. As usual, I'd like you to prepare for the lesson by getting out your worksheets. You'll need the table from last time. You'll need a pen and some scrap paper, and it would be a good idea to put any distractions like mobile phones safely away. When you're ready, hit play and we'll move forward. So first up, here's your do now. Last lesson, we were looking at how the Bolsheviks dealt with opposition during their first few months in power. And you've got 5 quick recall questions to have a go at here. When you're done, hit play and we'll mark them. And here are the answers. As usual, I'd like you to mark your own work. If you get one wrong, don't panic. Just remember to correct it, preferably in a different colour pen. And when you're finished, remember to add up your score and give yourself a mark out of 5. When you're done, hit play and we'll move forward. So here's a reminder of the big picture for this topic, Lenin and the Civil War. And at the moment, we're looking at the Bolsheviks' first few months in power. In today's lesson, we're going to look at how the Bolsheviks brought an end to Russia's participation in World War I. We're going to investigate the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. I want you to understand how and why the Bolsheviks signed this treaty. I'd like you to know a little bit about the terms of the treaty and the consequences which it had. And towards the end of the lesson, we're going to reach a judgment about whether the treaty was a disaster for the Bolsheviks. Next up, let's update our knowledge organisers. So here are the areas of content which we're going to touch on in today's lesson. And notice we're going to see a little bit more about 2 factors which helped the Bolsheviks to successfully hold on to power. We'll see Lenin's strong leadership in practice today, and we'll also see Lenin's capacity to make very pragmatic decisions, tough decisions, necessary for the Bolsheviks to hang on to power. Before you move forward, pause the video and update your own copy of the Knowledge Organiser. Now it's time for your starter. So today's lesson is all about the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and I've given you an American cartoon about the treaty which was published in 1918. Your starter is to look very closely at the cartoon. What can you see? And what do you think the message of the cartoon is? What point is it trying to make? I'd like you to pause the video now, think hard and record your ideas. And when you're done, hit play. Let's have a look at the cartoon and the point which it's trying to make. Hopefully you noticed there's a German removal van in the cartoon which has come to take away lots of valuable possessions. They've all been wrapped and labelled to Germany. This part of the cartoon represents all the Russian territory and resources which were given to Germany in the peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Hopefully you noticed in the background, running away from the scene are Lenin and Trotsky. They seem to be the ones who have sold off all the furniture and possessions. And that represents the fact that they were responsible for agreeing to the peace terms of this treaty. Of course, you've also noticed this angry bear that's woken up from his hibernation and has now come out with a rolling pin in his hands. This represents patriotic Russians who have woken up to or realised what the Bolsheviks have done in signing this treaty and are now opposing it. Let's look at the background to the treaty. After seizing power in Russia, Bolshevik leaders firmly expected the socialist revolution to spread across Europe. Lenin had written about this in his earlier works. He believed that World War I would collapse into a series of civil wars within countries, and that one by one the proletariats of Western Europe would rise up in socialist revolutions and overthrow their governments. Now remember, most of the Bolshevik leaders had lived much of their lives as adults in Western Europe, and they had devoted much of their adult lives to working for the triumph of the worldwide socialist revolution. Now, the fate of the worldwide revolution was much more important to them than the fate of any individual country. Russia was of interest because, in Lenin's view, it was the weakest link in the capitalist chain where worldwide revolution would begin. But make no mistake, worldwide revolution was the priority. And it wasn't just that they expected it to happen, they also believed it needed to happen because the socialist revolution in Russia could not survive on its own. Russia lacked an industrial base, and if the revolution did not spread, then Russia would be left alone as the only socialist country surrounded by hostile capitalist powers which would destroy it. So in order for socialism to survive in Russia, it had to spread beyond Russia's borders to the countries of Western Europe. Now, as soon as the Bolsheviks take power in Russia, they issued the Decree on Peace. This was a plea to the other fighting nations to end World War I with a fair peace treaty. What the Bolsheviks hoped was that their Decree on Peace would inspire the proletariats of Germany and France and Britain to rise up and demand peace. However, the Decree on Peace was ignored, and the other nations went on fighting and the war continued. And that presented the Bolsheviks with a problem, because the Russian army was disintegrating rapidly. Now, on the one hand, the disintegration of the army was a positive for the Bolsheviks, because it meant that the army generals could not use their units to crush the Bolshevik revolution. However, the disintegration of the army also left the Bolshevik government and Russia at the mercy of a German invasion. So, Trotsky requested an armistice from the Germans, and this was quickly agreed to, and peace talks began at the war-ravaged town of Brest-Litovsk. The Bolsheviks wanted to use the peace talks as a propaganda opportunity to show the Germans that they were a truly revolutionary regime. So Trotsky was picked to lead the Bolshevik negotiating team, but they also included a representative of the soldiers, a representative of the workers, and a representative of the peasants. Now, the team were in a motor car heading to the station to travel to the peace talks, when at the last minute they realised they had forgotten to bring a peasant representative. So they pulled over to the side of the road, panicking, and spotted an elderly peasant chap in the street. His name was Roman Stashkov. They called him over to the car and they asked him if he was a Bolshevik. He said no, but he was a radical left SR, and this was good enough for them. So they offered him a lift and he got into the car. Soon, however, he began to panic when he realised that the car was heading in entirely the wrong direction, and he asked them where they were taking him. They informed him that they were taking him with them to the peace talks, and that he was going to be the first ever peasant representative to take part in anything like this. And sure enough, he did take part. The German High Command, who they were negotiating with, were all made up of wealthy, successful aristocrats. They were absolutely shocked when the Bolshevik team sat down opposite them with this peasant representative. And they were also aghast at his manners at the table, particularly when dinner was served and the waiter came round and offered him a choice of red or white wine. Instead of picking one of them, he replied, "Which one is stronger?" concerned only with which of the two would get him drunk quickest. Now, as the peace talks began, the question of whether to sign a separate peace treaty with Germany split the Bolshevik Party three ways into what we would call three factions. Now, the leaders of these three factions were Bukharin, Lenin, and Trotsky. And your task now is to find out a little bit more about the policies which they pressed for. So I want you to use the information on page 121 to make yourself a table comparing their different positions towards making peace with Germany. You need to record what their policy was, and I want you just to summarise that in one bullet point. And then I want you to summarise what their reasons or justifications for their policy were. What arguments did they put forward to support their policy? When you're done on this, hit play and we'll share some ideas. Let's look at the policies of these three factions. Firstly, Bukharin and the left communists. They wanted to continue fighting the war, but they wanted to turn it into a revolutionary war, fought with the aim of spreading revolution abroad. Now, Bukharin argued that making a peace with capitalist Germany would discredit Bolshevism and dishonour the revolution. He argued that any peace deal would involve giving up Russian territory and resources to Germany, and this would strengthen the German regime, making revolution in Germany less likely. He also argued that fighting a revolutionary war would galvanise the Russian proletariat behind their new revolutionary government, and would inspire the proletariat in Western European countries to rise up against their own governments. And Bukharin also argued that even though the Russian army was disintegrating, a revolutionary war could be fought using a different kind of army, a partisan army, an army filled with ordinary workers and peasants who could fight using guerrilla tactics, ambushing the enemy instead of taking part in an organised traditional style of warfare. Lenin's position was entirely different. He wanted the Bolsheviks to sign an immediate peace deal with Germany, no matter how harsh the terms were. He justified this by arguing that the Bolsheviks had no reliable army with which to fight a revolutionary war, and Lenin did not believe that peasants and workers would fight for their new Bolshevik government. Lenin also warned that unless peace was made, the German army would reach Petrograd and crush the Bolshevik government and their revolution. Lenin said it was better to sign a shameful peace than get swept aside. Finally, Lenin was willing to leave aside his principles. Instead of prioritizing the world revolution, Lenin argued it was necessary to prioritize the revolution in Russia, and that making peace with the Germans would buy the Bolsheviks space and time to deal with their own internal enemies. Or in Lenin's words, the Bolsheviks needed to have both hands free to throttle the bourgeoisie. Trotsky's position was neither war nor peace. He argued that the Bolsheviks should declare an end to the war, but refuse to sign any peace treaty. Trotsky justified this by saying that any further German attack would then look like an act of aggression against the Russian people, and he believed that this would inspire the German proletariat to rise up against their own leaders. Trotsky's position was heavily criticized by Stalin, who said that this was no position at all. This was the first clash between Trotsky and Stalin, who were later to go on and become rivals for the leadership of the party in the 1920s. In this photograph, you can see the Bolshevik negotiating team arriving in Brest-Litovsk for the peace negotiations. And you can see them meeting and greeting the German High Command. Right in the centre of the photograph, you can see Trotsky, who was leading the Bolshevik delegation. Now, eventually, these peace talks lead to the signing of this treaty, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The way that the peace talks developed reveals quite a lot about the Bolshevik Party at this time. Let's look at how the negotiations unfolded. They began on the 9th of December 1917. Lenin instructed Trotsky to drag the talks out in the hope that this would allow time for revolution to break out in Western Europe. Trotsky was excellent at this. He tied the German High Command up in knots, discussing abstract points and principles of diplomacy. But still, there were no signs of revolution in Western Europe. A month later, 63 leading Bolsheviks met to discuss the peace terms, and they divided three ways into three factions. Bukharin's was the biggest faction. Over half of the Bolshevik leaders present backed his policy of a revolutionary war, which Lenin called suicidal. But the key meeting, the decisive meeting, came 3 days later, when the Bolshevik Central Committee met to vote. Lenin discovered that his faction was the smallest minority on the Central Committee, and so he abandoned his policy of signing an immediate peace at any cost and backed Trotsky's policy of neither war nor peace, which narrowly won the vote. Trotsky then returned to negotiations and managed to drag them out for 3 more weeks, with the German High Command becoming increasingly frustrated about this. On the 28th of January, Trotsky announced to the German High Command that Russia was leaving the war, but he refused to sign a peace treaty. The German negotiators were absolutely aghast. They just couldn't believe this behaviour. Never before had a European government conducted itself like this at peace talks. The following month, The German High Command finally ran out of patience with the Bolshevik negotiating team. They ended the armistice and restarted their offensive against Russia. Over the course of 5 days, the German army advanced 150 miles into Russian territory. Now, this was further than they had advanced in the previous 3 years of the war. Gaining control of so much new territory and approaching the capital city, Petrograd itself, put the Germans in an even stronger negotiating position, and they laid out even harsher peace terms for the Bolsheviks. There was intense debate among the Bolshevik leaders over whether to accept these new harsher terms or not. In the end, Lenin managed to convince the party to sign the peace terms. 2 factors allowed him to achieve this. Firstly, he made a very strong argument that unless the Bolsheviks signed these peace terms, then the German army would sweep into Petrograd and crush the Bolshevik government altogether. Secondly, Lenin threatened to resign from the Central Committee. This alarmed Trotsky, who feared it would lead to a lasting split in the party. So when it came to the vote, Trotsky abstained, and Lenin's position won. However, Trotsky was not prepared to sign the peace treaty himself, so he resigned as foreign commissar. In early March, the Bolsheviks signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The terms of the treaty were so harsh and so humiliating that none of the Bolshevik leaders could bring themselves to sign the treaty. Second-ranking Bolshevik leaders were sent to sign it. Now I want you to pause and think about this. What can we infer about Lenin and the Bolshevik Party from this episode? When you're ready and you've recorded your thoughts, hit play. Here are some inferences which we might make. Firstly, we can see that there were limits to Lenin's control of the party. He faced stiff opposition from other Bolshevik leaders and had to work hard to win the party round to his point of view. Secondly, we can see that there was a culture of intense and free debate among party leaders at that time. This suggests that the Bolshevik Party had some democratic qualities at the highest levels. We can also tell here that the party was very close to a historic and damaging split between its different factions. We can also see that Lenin was capable of making very tough and unpleasant decisions, which were necessary for the party to survive. And lastly, we can also see here that Lenin was a pragmatist. He was someone who was willing to sacrifice his principles, even world revolution, to hold on to power. Let's turn now to the results of this treaty. Firstly, we should note that the treaty brought an end to the war between Russia and Germany. The German advance was stopped and the Bolshevik government survived, although they did move the capital from Petrograd to Moscow for safety. The treaty came at a high cost to Russia, though, in terms of territory. Russia had to give up huge swathes of territory in Europe, including a third of its population and farmland and half of its industrial capacity. This was deeply humiliating. Russia effectively lost all of the European territory which it had gained in the previous 2 centuries. This loss of territory caused immediate food supply problems, particularly the loss of Ukraine, which was an excellent grain-producing territory. The humiliating peace treaty also led to an increase in opposition to the Bolsheviks. Patriotic Russians saw the treaty as a humiliation, and they joined anti-Bolshevik forces, and this made civil war more likely. The treaty also created opposition to the Bolshevik regime abroad. Britain and France were keen to get Russia back into the war and reopen the Eastern Front against Germany, so they began to fund anti-Bolshevik forces. The treaty also brought about the end of the Bolsheviks' alliance with the left SRs. They were disgusted at the terms of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and did not want to be associated with it. So the left SRs resigned from the Sovnarkom. They turned to terrorist acts, including assassinating the German ambassador in Moscow in the hope of reigniting the war. That same month, July 1918, the left SRs began an uprising in Moscow, which was only narrowly crushed by the Bolsheviks. The left SRs were subsequently wiped out as a party. The treaty also made public the divisions which now existed in the Bolshevik Party. The left communists, headed by Bukharin, resigned from the Central Committee to continue their policy of opposing the peace. However, we should note that this split was not long-lasting. It faded after Germany was defeated in November 1918, and that seemed to justify Lenin's policy of making a peace. Lastly, we should notice that the way in which Lenin pressed for the signing of this peace treaty created a precedent for the future. Lenin had demonstrated that protecting the revolution in Russia was to be prioritized above spreading worldwide revolution. Now that's important for later, because we will see how the Bolsheviks fall back again on that principle during the 1920s. Having looked now at the results of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, I want you to consider this question. Do you think that the Bolsheviks gained more than they lost at Brest-Litovsk? I want you to pause the video now and give this some thought. I want you to note down your decision and your reasons why. But you only have to write 3 or 4 sentences here, no more. You're just going to record your decision. When you're ready, hit play again. Your next task is to use the information on pages 121 to 122 in your textbook, plus the information in this tutorial, to complete the final row on your table analysing Lenin's solutions. Again, bullet points is fine here. There's no need for full sentences. When you've done that, reflect on the prediction you made at the start of lesson 1, prediction E. Were you correct about that? Before we end this lesson, I'd like us to come back to one of our big questions. Why did the Bolsheviks become dictators? Now we have 2 hypotheses on this. Hypothesis 1 is that the Bolsheviks always intended to set up a dictatorship and that it was part of their ideology. Hypothesis 2 is that they did not plan this dictatorship, but it developed as a response to the Civil War. Now, in today's lesson, we've seen that before the Civil War, in their early months of rule, there was intense and democratic debate within the Bolshevik party over the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This is important evidence which you can use to support hypothesis 2. We can use it to show that before civil war broke out, the Bolsheviks demonstrated some features of a democratic party. So I'd like you to update your table now, recording this new evidence on it. Remember, you don't have to write a great deal here. 1 or 2 bullet points is all you need. Well done in today's lesson, Year 12. Remember, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and there you can watch all the previous lesson videos. In the next lesson, we're going to gather together everything we've learned over the past 4 lessons and we're going to use it to build a piece of extended writing. I'll look forward to teaching you then.